Hello and welcome to Reduce AVS TCO and Increase Performance by Adding Azure NetApp Files Data Stores. Today's webinar is sponsored by NetApp and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. That Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues you might be experiencing. A browser refresh will fix most audio, video, and slide advancement issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. At the top of the list is a pair of PDFs from NetApp. One is on top reasons why the VMware and Azure combo is exactly what your enterprise applications need, and the other is the slide deck for today's presentation. Also in that section are links to the Gorilla Guide Book Club, where you can get access to Actual Tech Media's great printed resources on technology topics, as well as a link to the ATM Event Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events. So I encourage you to access those resources now and share them with your friends and colleagues. Third, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. And finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters. So to help encourage your questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. At the end of the event, we'll look at all the questions that came in, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. And with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. I'm excited to introduce you to our speakers today. We have Arndt de Geer and Sean Luce. They're both technical marketing engineers at NetApp. They've got a lot of great information and insights to share with us today, and I'm really looking forward to this session. So now I'm going to turn it over to Arndt to
Hey, thank you, Scott. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for having us on your webcast today. We'll introduce Azure NetApp Files data stores for Azure Vmware Solution. My name is Arndt de Geer. I'm an Azure NetApp Files technical marketing engineer. And Sean, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Arndt. Thank you. My name is Sean Luce, and I'm a technical marketing engineer for Azure NetApp Files.
Great. So let's look at the agenda for this session. We'll first introduce Azure VMware Solution. We'll look at what that really is, what it encompasses. And we'll look at Azure NetApp Files as well. So just what is that? And then we'll talk about why Azure NetApp Files is a good solution in certain scenarios. We'll talk about the storage expansion of Azure VMware Solution and why that may be required. We'll talk about migration and disaster recovery into this solution. We'll talk about when to consider Azure NetApp Files data stores. And then we have some workflow slides that we won't actually show because they're covered in the demo that comes right after that. But the slides will be available in the handover. So the demo will be the complete workflow of creating and connecting an Azure NetApp Files data store, which is basically a two-phase approach. And then at the end, we have some additional information for you, and we'll review the learnings from this session, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end, hopefully. Right, so what is Azure VMware Solution? What is that all about? Well, as the name suggests, it really is VMware in Azure, with the big difference being that we can now consume VMware as a service. Obviously that means that we no longer need to acquire any hardware into our on-premises data center. In Azure, everything is already there to a degree, obviously, but there's a large amount of infrastructure built out for us. And we can now, using our Azure account, acquire the use of a cluster, a VMware cluster in Azure, and be charged on a daily basis for the use of the cluster. And that brings a lot of benefit because we can now basically expand our cluster with an extra node or 2 extra nodes if circumstances so dictate, if we're running out of horsepower. And that brings an unprecedented amount of flexibility. We no longer have to size for our maximum workload because we can basically scale our deployment up and down to accommodate the workload. And there's some news to be had with the Datastore introduction that we'll do next. On-premises is displayed here as well, because we strongly believe that this solution will be used for migrating existing workloads from VMware on-premises into Azure, and to potentially do disaster recovery for on-premises workloads into Azure, and to basically take over for DR data centers, which many customers are looking to stop using. And there's some really good news on that front as well. What we don't see is customers building new workloads on top of Azure VMware Solution in Azure, because obviously there's other ways to do that with Azure native VMs, which can utilize all kinds of storage solutions as well, and give possibly even more flexibility. But for DR and migration, this is an excellent solution. So let's have a look at a little more detail about the solution. It's scalable, as I indicated. It's scalable VMware. We can really just say, well, we currently have 5 nodes. I'll now want a 6th node added to our cluster. So we go to the portal and we change the number of nodes from 5 to 6, click apply, and it happens, and our cluster gets expanded. It's like magic almost, and it has nothing to do with any physical hardware installs. So it brings a lot of ease of use, and it brings great performance as well. It comes bundled with vSAN, and vSAN, as you can see in the table here, runs on either SSDs or NVMe SSDs that are included in the bare metal machinery that sits in the infrastructure. So performance is great, but there is a concern that customers have expressed, and that's around capacity. Can you talk to that a little bit, Sean, and explain to us what customers are reporting?
Yeah, so one of the shortcomings I'd say today about regarding Azure VMware Solution is the lack of ability to scale the storage capacity independently of compute. So if you need more storage, the only way to really get that is to add additional hosts. And what happens quite often is that we size for storage, and because we're sizing for storage, we now have wasted compute and memory resources in the environment, which no one likes to spend money that they're for resources that they aren't using.
Yeah, it basically throws off the balance, right, of the different components that we have, and we have a nice way to help us decide in what kind of situation we're in by looking at our TCO estimator a little bit later on. But first, let's go and look at the other side of what we're introducing today, which is Azure NetApp Files. So what is Azure NetApp Files? Well, similar to Azure VMware Solution, this is storage technology powered by NetApp that is integrated into the Azure solution. And here too, we can consume storage volumes that we can basically provision from the portal. So we don't have to deploy anything physically. We just go to the portal, check our Azure NetApp account, because we do go through accounts, and more detail on that later on. And we get to deploy a volume with different types of protocols. It's all file-based, and we support NFS v3, NFS v4.1, and SMB3, and even dual protocol. So in some situations, customers like to fill a volume with data from one platform, from Linux, and then open it from a Windows or either a workstation side or maybe vice versa in some data analytics configurations. And we allow for that to happen as well. So we can have dual protocol, both NFS and SMB access to the same volume. We provide on-premises class performance with multiple tiers, and more on that later on as well, but the 3 tiers are Ultra, Premium, and Standard. We have enterprise data management features included with the solution, and those include snapshots for very fast primary data protection and recovery, clones for feeding test and dev environments. There's replication as well for replicating data to other regions, because we're now talking regions, not necessarily data centers. And backup is also available in order to be able to protect data, not just by snapshots, but by actually copying data off to other media. And it's all presented with a consistent Azure experience from a billing and support perspective, all through the portal. So it's a first-party Microsoft-supported solution. It's not a marketplace. Workloads that we see customers deploy, well, basically anything. Enterprise file workloads, databases are popular. We see some Oracle, we see a lot of SAP HANA that is deployed on top of Azure NetApp Files, but also containerized applications, high-performance computing VDI, and obviously, as we're introducing today, Azure Vmware Solution. And verticals and industries, well, you can see for yourself. Basically, any vertical in industry is deployed on this solution. So let's move ahead and let's talk about why Azure NetApp Files. And we probably have given some of this away already, but it really is there to resolve a problem that customers face when they are looking at migrating workloads into the cloud. Because it is file-based, customers can now transition workloads, being those VMware or enterprise NAS workloads, to the cloud without having to refactor and re-architect. And that's an important benefit, because if we don't need to really change anything to the architecture of our application, of our workloads, then it becomes a lot easier to actually bring workloads from on-premises into the cloud. It gives us much more flexibility, and it reduces risk. Risk is costly, and it also takes a lot of time to do risk mitigation. So customers are extremely happy for us to help them reduce a lot of the risk. So if we then look at where Azure NetApp Files fits in the larger picture of all services in Azure, it really is a small speck on the next slide, where we can see the Azure NetApp Files icon just dropping into the storage section. There's a lot of platform services that are offered in Azure. There is support for hybrid cloud, there's security and management, there's compute services, there's networking services, and now in the square of storage, we find Azure NetApp Files next to disks and Azure Files and all those other services that exist. So great, let's now look at the AVS part, and let's look at how we can bring the two together, how we can bring the strength of Azure NetApp Files to support the Azure VMware Solution. Azure VMware Solution has been around for a while and has already supported the guest OS mounted capability over NFS and SMB. But as you can see, what's new here in the left side of this diagram is the fact that we can now support Datastores. The feature is in preview, so it's not available for production just yet. But we do now allow the ESXi hosts to have Datastores connected directly to them. And all the integration work to make that happen from the portal has been done. And it's actually fairly impressive to see how it all works now. So again, what's new is Azure NetApp Files data stores can be connected to our vSphere environment or our Azure VMware solution to be complete. And we are now able to store VMDKs onto an Azure NetApp Files volume as well, next to the other capability. And as we'll see later on, there may be some very good reasons to actually do just that. Before we go there, Sean, can you introduce some benefits of Azure NetApp Files data stores?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Art. So one of the big things that we're trying to do with Azure NetApp Files data stores is lower your overall cost of ownership. So we can actually save money by scaling storage independently of the compute. So we can use Azure NetApp Files to support storage-intensive AVS workloads by scaling or by adding additional storage without having to add additional AVS hosts. So things like imaging, archives, and GIS workloads that are data intensive can really benefit from Azure NetApp Files data stores. In addition, we can also use Azure NetApp Files data stores to create a minimally host or an environment with minimal compute for DR scenarios. So you can imagine a scenario where you're using Azure VMware Solution as a disaster recovery site for your on-prem environment. You can have a minimal 3-host AVS cluster deployed, while that normally wouldn't have enough storage to contain the entire workload. We can now extend that cluster's storage using Azure NetApp Files data store to give you enough capacity. And then when a disaster event occurs, we can then scale up that AVS cluster to then accommodate the remaining workload or the entire workload. So we can scale up to petabytes on Azure NetApp Files data stores without adding additional hosts. Next, Azure NetApp Files data stores is very, very easy to manage, both performance and availability. So this is a fully managed solution with 4 nines of availability, built-in scale and performance. So we can essentially resize volumes on the fly, either increase or decrease those volume sizes to get more performance, all non-disruptively and in near real time as business needs change. We can also move volumes from one capacity pool to the other. So we can non-disruptively move volumes between the various tiers. So if we have a volume in standard, we can quickly move that volume up to ultra to get more performance should you need it. Lastly, we have very flexible data management capabilities. We can take virtual machine consistent snapshots. We can replicate using our cross-region replication, backup capabilities. All the data management functions are built in and part of that service. We can also clone data stores. So we can make what are called instant clones or clones based on snapshots. So we can clone those data stores and clone your VMs very quickly. And this is all with using the resources built into the platform itself. So we're not using host resources to do a lot of these functions. They're offloaded to the service itself. So there's just some of the benefits of Azure NetApp Files data stores.
Yeah, I really like the fact that we can do the replication and cloning without actually taking resources on the AVS platform. So that leaves more resources available to run the workloads. And the same is for the ability to scale performance. We can like you said, migrate a volume from one capacity pool to another to change its performance characteristics. And initially, and when we compare this to an on-premises environment, we always scale for the maximum performance, right? And then we have to deal what we've got. But in the cloud, things are different, and you can actually change the characteristics on the fly. So we can have a volume that's running in a premium tier, and if it needs double the performance, we can just move it to the ultra tier, leave it there for as long as it takes, and then potentially even move it back to the premium tier, and that can help save quite a bit of money when it comes to the total cost of ownership.
You got it.
Right. Let's move on to the next section here. which is about migration and disaster recovery. Okay, so we'll introduce just a couple of solutions for migration and DR. There are many more, and there are quite a few third-party vendors that enable migration and disaster recovery. But first of all, let's discuss HCX. Because HCX is obviously a VMware product, and it is included with Azure Vmware Solution. It helps accelerate cloud adoption. It can help with hybrid cloud extension, because it can help with load balancing between the on-premises environment that we see on the left and the Azure VMware Solution on the right of this picture. And it can also help with bulk migration. So we can potentially just pick up a complete workload, even if that consumes 50 VMs, and migrate all of them into Azure VMware Solution. Potentially we can migrate them back again as well. And this brings a lot of flexibility to customers again, because it basically allows them to use the cloud as an extension to their on-premises environment. And they can burst workloads to the cloud for as long as, again, it takes for them to utilize the extra resources that are offered, and then bring them back again, or even stop them if they're no longer needed. So the usage scenarios are, there's so many. Migrations and transformation, also hardware and software refreshes and upgrades. We can potentially free up our on-premises installation by migrating workloads away, do some hardware upgrades, and migrate workloads back again. We can consolidate smaller data centers to the cloud, or disaster recovery data centers to the cloud, as we indicated before. It allows us to go fully hybrid, where some of the workload is running on premises and another part is running in the cloud. So yeah, rapid migration, burst capacity, all these are now all the flexibility advantages that we see in the cloud. The other solution that we want to introduce is disaster recovery. With disaster recovery, things are slightly different than with migration. Migration is a prepared move of a workload from on-premises to the cloud, whereas disaster recovery is an unannounced. We're preparing for a situation where we all of a sudden need to migrate or resume a workload in the cloud, and that requires a different approach from the perspective of replication and rehydration of the replicated data in the cloud. And Jetstream have built a really great solution for doing both of the purposes. What they do is they have these I/O filters that you can see underneath the VMs, and through their DRVA, their virtual appliance, they can replicate all the writes that these VMs do to local storage. They can replicate those writes to Azure VMware storage, Azure Blob storage, actually. And the reason they select blob storage is that during normal operation, we're not going to have very much workload consumption in Azure, and that helps reduce TCO of the solution. So we can continually update the blob storage using the continuous replication. Continuous data protection is what this is called as well. And then we get a choice whether a workload gets rehydrated when it's time to do the disaster recovery, or for more mission critical workloads, we can rehydrate the workloads continuously. And this is where the addition of Azure NetApp Files may come in handy, because continuous replications and continuous rehydration now lets us basically keep a mirror of the VM decays of our workloads that are running on premises in the cloud on an Azure NetApp Files volume that's sitting in a standard tier. And the advantage of that is obviously that it's not as expensive as the tier that is required to actually run those workloads. But since the replication I/O patterns are typically not that high, we can suffice in many cases with a standard volume. The advantage is that the VMDKs are there and they're ready to be picked up by the VMs. That brings a lot of benefit when it comes to the time to restart or to resume the workloads in Azure. So it solves the problem of RPO and RTO all at the same time, while for some other workloads that are not critical, we may choose to have a different approach and just rehydrate them on time. This also brings in the concept of a pilot-like cluster, where we size the actual Azure VMware solution cluster for just running the continuous replication. And then when it's time to do the disaster recovery, we can obviously start the critical workloads within the pilot-like cluster, as it will have at least 3 nodes. And then we can upgrade the standard volume to be a premium or an ultra volume if performance dictates that. And then we can start rebuilding or rehydrating the workloads from blob storage through the DRVA in Azure and wait for them to become ready. So it's a very good hybrid approach with different levels of RTO and RPO and associated cost levels. Right, so let's move on and try and figure out in what circumstances we should consider Azure NetApp Files data stores. As Sean said earlier in the intro, as soon as the storage utilization or the storage requirement is heavy relative to the CPU and memory requirements, we're going to see a mismatch, because the nodes in Azure VMware Solution come with a fixed amount of storage. So for those environments that are storage heavy, need much more storage than is provided by the nodes from a perspective of a CPU and memory, we have built this calculator. So for the purpose of helping us decide whether or not to add ANF data stores, we have come up with this TCO estimator. And we'll actually go to the live site, and you might want to take a note of this. It's aka.ms/AVS ANF calc. So you just go there now. And what we'll see is a set of numbers, predefined numbers that basically describe our environment. We have a total number of VMs. We have a setting of number of vCPUs per physical core. We have the average vCPUs per VM, average memory per VM, and average utilized storage per VM. And we'll come back to that in just a second. So there's also some inputs for vSAN specifics, such as the slack space, which is recommended to be at least 25%, and the vSAN on-disk format efficiency being at 90%. And we can select the storage policy. The most, well, it's not the most, but for larger deployments, customers will typically choose FTT2, which takes a 33% hit on the total usable storage capacity from vSAN. And there's a setting for dedupe and compression. For this particular environment, I really like to use the sizing decisions table here, because it tells us for this scenario how many hosts we would need to run this configuration successfully, driven by CPU, memory, and storage. And as we can see, for CPU, we'd only need 4 hosts. For memory, we'd need 8. But for storage, we need 18. And that's largely caused by the pretty heavy storage utilization that we see per VM here at 500 gig. So in order to deploy 18 VMs to get sufficient capacity, we're looking at a TCO per year of almost 1.7 million. That seems pretty expensive. So let's see how we can save some of that cost. I'll close the sizing decisions to free up some screen space. And down here we'll see what happens if we were to combine the supplied space from vSAN with ANF ultra tier volume capacity. So we'll now need only 8 hosts because that was the required for the memory. We no longer need more hosts for storage because we're offloading 92 terabytes to Azure NetApp Files. And this will sit on an Azure NetApp Files data store connected to our AVS environment. The TCO for this is now 1.2. So we're looking at a savings of 28%. And there's even more to save if we don't need ultra tier performance for these data stores. We can scale them down to premium. We can scale them down to standard and see the actual performance savings, or the TCO savings. And 46% is a pretty impressive number. We can also add additional combination settings if we have a good picture of the individual workloads where some may require ultra tier performance and others may not, and they can be happy on a standard tier performance. Then we click this box and an extra line appears. But what I'd like to spend some time with you on, Sean, is the bottom one here, AVS with ANF for disaster recovery. So as per the introduction with Jetstream and HCX, can you talk why we only have 3 nodes here? That looks like a pilot light cluster configuration, right?
Exactly, yes. So what we're able to do with Azure NetApp Files data stores, like we mentioned before, is we're able to scale the storage capacity and the compute independently. So what this allows us to do is have these pilot-like clusters that are only 3 nodes, which is the minimum for Azure's VMware solution. The minimum being 3 isn't going to provide enough storage to accommodate the entire disaster recovery site, or the site that we're trying to protect. So now we can add Azure NetApp Files data stores to increase the overall storage capacity of that cluster to accommodate the entire workload. And what this does is this allows us, in a disaster recovery event, this allows you to run your most critical services and applications immediately. So those 3 nodes can run critical applications such as Active Directory or DNS, things like that, so you can get started and get up and running as soon as possible. And then we can add nodes to that pilot-like cluster as needed to accommodate the remaining applications and the rest of that workload. But Azure NetApp Files data stores is what allows us to have this pilot-like cluster and have those minimum compute resources deployed until there's a disaster event.
This is pretty impressive. Let's look at the TCO savings. We're at 66% from a full-size cluster with 18 nodes, which would be required to do a complete disaster recovery for this configuration. So a lot of savings to be had, and the numbers are going to differ for each of your personal circumstances. So plug in the numbers on this estimator, check the number of VMs, check the number of CPUs required and the memory per VM, and in the future you'll be able to use existing data from your on-premises deployment supplied by RV Tools, and you will then be able to import those numbers into this estimator, and it will tell you how much there is potentially to save. And like we said before, if the deployment is fairly storage heavy, there is a potentially very impressive savings to be made. You can also do or introduce guest connected storage, or bring over the file services that may be installed somewhere, and the savings can be even higher if I were to introduce like 200 terabytes of file services, and they can potentially sit on a standard tier. So look at the savings here, 80%. That's really impressive. Anything to add to this, Sean? I think this is a really clear picture and a very useful tool.
No, I think you've covered it. Let's head into the demo.
But before we see the product itself, let us show you how Azure NetApp Files is constructed. So what do we see here, Sean?
Yeah, thanks, Arne. So there are several components that make up the Azure NetApp Files solution. kind of at the top of the hierarchy here is what's called a NetApp account. Now, a NetApp account is tied to a particular region, and you can have up to 10 NetApp accounts within your Azure subscription. And then under the NetApp account, we have what are called capacity pools. Now, capacity pools are where the billing starts. Capacity pools come in one of 3 different tiers: standard, premium, or ultra. And depending on the tier that you select and also the size of that volume, those 2 levers will determine the performance or the throughput of those volumes. So you see here we have capacity pools. You can have up to 25 capacity pools within the NetApp account. And then finally, underneath that capacity pool, you'll see that we have the actual volumes. Now, these volumes are what actually serve data. They can be anywhere from 100 gigabytes up to 100 terabytes. And again, these are what are going to translate into your Azure VMware Solution data stores. So these volumes can be increased as far as size or decreased as well. And they can also be moved from one capacity pool to the other. And all of this can be done non-disruptively to scale the performance and the size of those volumes as your business needs change in near real time. So yeah, you can have up to 12.5 petabytes of enterprise and NAS storage in a single Azure NetApp account.
Awesome.
So now that you have an understanding there of kind of how things look, we can now dive into the portal and actually see what it looks like to provision an Azure NetApp Files data store. So in this environment, we've done a couple things already. We already have our Azure VMware Solution private cloud provisioned and created. So that's already been done. And here you can see that we already have the NetApp account created as well. So the first step is going to be to create that capacity pool. We're going to choose our service level as ultra, and then give it the minimum size of 4 terabytes for this exercise, and leave that quality of service type as auto. In just a few seconds, we now have our capacity pool. We select that capacity pool, and we click on volumes. And this is where we can create the backing volume for our Azure VMware Solution data store. So we give our volume a name. In this case, we're going to select ANF Datastore 01. We're going to give that volume a size. And again, the size directly impacts the performance of that volume. In this case, we're going to set that to the full size of the capacity pool, which is 4 terabytes. And then we're going to make sure that our network settings are correct. And on the next screen here, we're going to select the NFS protocol. And we're going to leave the defaults as NFS v3, and then make sure we check that box, Azure VMware Solution Data Store. We're going to hit next, apply any tags that you may need in your environment. And finally, review and create. We'll review those settings and make sure our validation has passed. And then we'll go ahead and click create. The first Azure NetApp Files volume that you do create can take a few minutes, as it's building a lot of that back-end networking infrastructure in order to create those private connections within your virtual network. So once that volume is created, we can now head back to our Azure VMware Solution private cloud, click on Storage, and click on Connect Azure NetApp Files Volume at the top. This is going to allow us to connect this volume that we created as a data store. So we're first going to select our account, our capacity pool, and finally that volume that we just created. And then we're going to select which cluster we want to add that to. In this case, we're going to pick the default, which is cluster 1. And then we're going to give that data store a name. So this is the name that it will appear within the vSphere client. I like to keep those names the same to avoid any confusion later on. And this process to attach that Azure NetApp Files volume as a data store only takes a few minutes. You can see there it's already done. We can click Go to Resource, and now we can see that we have a brand new data store connected to our AVS private cluster. We'll come in here and log into the vSphere client just to verify, and you can see that we now see that data store, and we'll go ahead and migrate a running virtual machine to that data store. You're going to select change storage only from the migrate submenu, and then you're also going to need to change the VMware storage policy, VM storage policy to data store default, and that will get rid of any warnings for compatibility. You see now our compatibility checks are all succeeded. We'll hit next and finally finish, and that will migrate or storage vMotion that virtual machine over to our new Azure NetApp Files data store. And as you can see, it's already starting to build out that folder structure on the Azure NetApp Files data store. And you'll see here in just a few seconds that our migration is now completed. And that's it. That's all there is to it. We've just provisioned an Azure NetApp Files data store and migrated our first virtual machine. And just to reiterate, it can be scaled up and down independently and non-disruptively. So if you need more space or you need more throughput, you can go ahead and increase the size of that volume or even move it to a higher tier. And the same thing for the other direction as well. We can scale that volume down if performance isn't as high, if performance requirements aren't as high, we can scale that volume down as well. We do have best practices outlined on Azure documentation. If you head to docs.microsoft.com, you can see best practices for recommendations as far as numbers of data stores and sizes of those data stores as well.
Brilliant. This looks a surprising lot like an on-premises environment, so it's great to see that it's really just the same in Azure now. So yeah, thanks for that demo, Sean. That's awesome.
Yeah, of course. You're welcome.
Let's talk about what we have learned in this session. Next slide, please. We have found, or we've seen, that we can expand the storage capacity of AVS, and that no longer limits us to the capacity that's offered by vSAN when it comes to deployments that require more storage capacity than is available when the perspective is the CPU or memory. Azure NetApp Files provides enterprise-class performance, availability, data management, including efficient snapshot-based data protection and cloning as an additional bonus, so data can be protected and replicated more easily. We can save costs by scaling volume performance up and down when required. So in normal operation mode, we can make a volume a standard volume. And then when it's time to do the disaster recovery, we can actually scale it up to be ultra performance to support the performance that our workloads require. We can instantly satisfy capacity requirements by dynamically changing the data store size, effectively the volume size. So if we upgrade the size of a volume, the data store will grow automatically with it. And also by adding external storage capacity, we can prevent the waste of AVS solution CPU and memory because we no longer need to add more nodes just to add storage capacity. And lastly, and quite importantly actually, I/O and memory is offloaded from AVS, which aids in the total Azure VMware Solution performance because a lot of the I/O activity that is storage related is no longer driven by the vSphere nodes themselves. And with that, we have come to the end of the session, and we'll open it up for Q&A. And while we do so, you can get started now. Here are some links for you to click to get back to the introduction of Azure VMware Solution, to learn more about Azure NetApp Files, and also to open up an Azure free trial with the third link on this page. So let's look at what questions we have.
All right, gentlemen, nice presentation and demo. Really appreciate that learning slide as well. Are you ready for some questions?
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, super. So the first one here is Azure NetApp Files data store support with Azure VMware Solution. Is that only for on-premises NetApp customers?
No, so actually, Azure NetApp Files is actually a Microsoft product. So this is an Azure first-party offering. You don't need to be an existing NetApp customer to use Azure and any product within Azure. So yeah, anyone can use it. You can log into the Azure portal today and search for NetApp, and you can find Azure NetApp Files.
Okay, all right, great. Why is Azure enabling Azure NetApp file storage into their Azure VMware Solution offering when they have vSAN today?
vSAN, as we explained in the slide deck and for a part in the demo as well, comes with a fixed capacity per node, and there's no way to have more storage capacity for the storage heavy deployments. And so customers are either looking at adding more nodes just to add the storage capacity and increase the vSAN space, but they now have an alternative to actually offload some of that and keep the number of nodes in line with the CPU and memory requirements, and still have external data store capacity for running additional workloads. And as we saw in the TCO discussion, and I recommend people to actually try this on for themselves on the link, to actually demonstrate that if the storage requirement is much heavier than the CPU and memory requirements for the AVS deployment, then there is money to be saved, and it works out well because of the offload of storage-related IOs from vSAN, and there's additional features, obviously, with storage-based replication called cross-region replication to bring data to other locations as well.
Okay. Yeah, and aren't you mentioned the links there. I do want to bring the links back up here. And this next question, Sean, you might have hit this one a little bit in your first answer, but the question here is, how can an Azure customer get this solution today?
Yeah, so we actually have some great documentation out there, and I'll put a link. I'll put a link in chat as well. But you really just log into the Azure portal. If you already have Azure VMware Solution deployed, then you're kind of halfway there. At that point, you just want to go over to the Azure NetApp Files area of the Azure portal and just start deploying Azure NetApp Files. But yeah, it's pretty straightforward. We have really good documentation, which I'll share a link to now.
Okay. All right. Super. The next question, we have a two-parter from Naidu, so I'll ask them one at a time. The first part of the question is, how did the problem that used to constrain the expansion of storage without expanding the compute go away with your solution?
Well, that is basically answered by the previous question as well to a degree. The whole I won't call it a limitation, but the design is that each node in AVS provides a fixed amount of storage, and there's 3 or 4 different node types. You may find only 1 or 2 in your subscription because it's dependent on the region. And the capacity per node type is a fixed piece of information, right? We won't be able to say, I want to attach more NVMe storage to this node because it's a given piece of bare metal configuration that sits in the data center. And so I'm coming back to what I said earlier. If you want to, or if you need to add more storage capacity than what is offered by vSAN, you can add more nodes to make vSAN wider and create more capacity that way. But there's a TCO advantage by not adding more nodes and adding Azure NetApp Files data stores instead. And those Azure NetApp Files data stores, they will sit in the same data center, but they are not hosted on the actual AVS infrastructure. They sit externally on Azure NetApp Files solution. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, yeah. And then the second part of the question is when the workloads can be moved to cloud and brought back as needed, would we not, as a customer, incur egress costs of data movement?
That's a fair point, and yes, that is the case. There will be cost of data movement involved in such situations. So to just move workloads in and out because it can be done, that might not be the best approach. But we're talking about bursting workloads into the cloud, which may bring additional advantages to our on-premises deployment, because we can either size our on-premises deployment for the maximum workload that we'll ever have, and add many more physical nodes into our data center, or we can now basically size for the average workload, and whenever we need more capacity, whenever we need more CPU, more memory, we can burst to the cloud and bring some of the workloads over for as long as it takes to actually run them. Think of monthly data processing that happens in many environments. So we can now use the cloud as an expansion to what we have locally. And as long as we don't size it for the maximum and only use it to a certain size when we need it, the cost can be quite limited. Does that make sense?
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, super. We had a point here from Scott F, who says, "What do you recommend for the headache I have trying to grasp all this great information?" So I don't know about that one, but there is a lot of great information coming people's way here. Next question: Can customers, and Arndt, you had talked about sort of the choice between vSAN and the Azure NetApp Files data stores. Can customers move VMs between vSAN and the Azure NetApp Files data stores?
Absolutely, they can, and it was shown in the demo that Sean did. You can basically move VMs up and down between vSAN and your ANF data stores, also between ANF data stores. In many cases, we'll have more than one ANF data store for all kinds of flexibility and for also workload consolidation. It may make sense to have 6 or 8 or even more data stores. So yes, you can move workloads between data stores, and from the perspective of compatibility, they're really all the same, although the fault tolerance settings are different. There's no specific fault tolerance settings for Azure NetApp Files data stores, as the fault tolerance is built into the Azure NetApp Files platform. For data stores that run, for vSAN data stores, there obviously is a fault tolerance setting, because vSAN runs on top of the physical hardware, and you'll need to take some protection measures for device failures on the physical nodes. In Azure NetApp Files, any device failures or any network failures, even controller failures are fully transparent, and the solution will just continue to run even if such events would occur.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned fault tolerance there. So can the NetApp Files data stores on AVS be used as a disaster recovery target, sort of as a replacement for on-premises DR data centers?
Absolutely, and this is where the one of the other questions came up. How about cost? And interestingly, we can obviously go for the big bang approach and disaster recovery, everything that we have on our on-premises deployment into Azure this way. but we recommend to have, to at least do some sort of a classification for the most critical workloads and the less critical workloads, and then treat them accordingly. Because for very critical workloads that have very tight RTOs and RPOs, you can actually do a replication-based disaster recovery using tools like Jetstream or from other vendors to bring the data into Azure and then actually scale up the deployment at the moment the disaster recovery happens. But during normal operation, when you're only doing the replication, the deployment can be very small. It can be just the minimum size cluster, which is only 3 nodes, and you can scale it up upon the disaster recovery. And the same thing goes for the actual Azure NetApp Files volume. You can continuously rehydrate data into Azure, into an Azure NetApp Files volume, so all the VMDKs are ready to be started. And that can save a lot of cost because you can keep them at the standard performance tier. And then when it's time to do the disaster recovery, you can scale it up to premium or ultra, which is more expensive, but also supplies more performance. Right? So.
Okay. Yep. No, makes a lot of sense. So it looks like we're running out of time, but I guess Arndt, if any sort of closing thoughts or recommendations for people to get started.
Well, we would recommend people to actually try these links, copy them if they haven't already done so, and if they have further questions, feel free to schedule the VMware strategy session. That link will actually take you to a contact form, and feel free to contact one of our cloud solution architects that way. And for questions, our email addresses are there, and we'll do our best to turn those around very quickly.
All right. Excellent. Well, Arndt and Sean, thank you both for putting together a really informative presentation and for all your insights here in the Q&A and for bringing us up to speed on NetApp. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
You're welcome.
Thanks again for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
And I will leave this slide up here, just so especially so you can grab that schedule VMware strategy session link or Sean and Arndt's emails there at the bottom while we do our prize drawing. So the $300 Amazon gift card prize drawing today, the winner is John Abalencia from California. So congratulations to John. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank NetApp again for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. That concludes today's event. Have a great rest of your day.